Hi there. I'm going to talk about the coup that took place on the 17th of November on the streets of Harare in Zimbabwe. On the 17th of November, uh, tanks rolled onto the streets of Harare, putting an end to 37 years of Robert Mugabe's dictatorship. But why had the man who had an iron grip on Zimbabwean politics for close to 40 years suddenly lost control of his political party, and the military who had been loyal to him for the past 40 years? For a start, the ravages of old age had caught up with Robert Mugabe. He was 93 then and incoherent at times, and his speech was now slurred. And it was ambitions for the presidency, for a life presidency, that had taken him as far as 2017. But then he had a 52-year-old wife, Grace Mugabe, nicknamed Gucci, who led their own faction in the ruling ZANU-PF party, the G40. Robert Mugabe had signaled on multiple occasions that he was now ready to give the reins of power to Grace, and that angered the army generals who wanted Emmerson Mnangagwa to take over from Robert Mugabe. The generals had built on their own faction called Cosleg, and Cosleg was built up during the Zimbabwe Defense Forces involvement in the DRC war. Cosleg had struck deals for logging concessions. The company called Sosebo and another one called the SAB Congo. These logging, Emmerson Mnangagwa was its civilian front, while this was entirely an entity composed of military top brass. The companies were owned by the generals in the Zimbabwe Defense Forces. Well, before we get to November 17, on the 8th of November, Simon Kaya Moyo, the information minister, announced Emmerson Mnangagwa's expulsion from the ZANU-PF party, and he's acting as vice president, the other vice president of the country. While all this was taking place, Robert Mugabe had prepared for this eventuality, and he knew that the generals would prepare to interfere militarily once it was clear that Emmerson Mnangagwa was going to be sacked. On the 3rd of November, he sent the Army General in charge of military operations, Major General Trust Mugoba, to Ethiopia to take part in an African Union standby force. And then General Chiwenga, the man in charge of the entire defense forces, he went to China supposedly on business, and while Mugabe had made sure that both Chiwenga and Mugoba would be out of the country, and so he could fire Mnangagwa without any blowback from the generals. Chiwenga, on the other hand, was laying the groundwork for Cosleg's next move, which was to implement a coup d'etat. While in Beijing, Chiwenga met with the Chinese defense minister Chang Wanquan, and then he went on to meet with Li Zuocheng, China's chief of the joint staff of the People's Liberation Army. The coup plotters wanted to make sure that they had protection from a major power in case things did not go their own way. And whilst Chiwenga was in China, Emmerson Mnangagwa fled the country because he now feared for his life, and his contact within the military had told him not to use the Robert Mugabe International Airport, and equally he could not make the road trip to Breed. The G40 aligned police would just pick him up, and he was sure they would execute him. Instead, Emmerson Mnangagwa used the Forbes border post on the eastern border and fled to Mozambique. Then he went to state on from South Africa that his life had been in danger and he had to flee. While Emmerson Mnangagwa is already in Johannesburg, Chiwenga lands at the Robert Mugabe Airport and is back in Harare. He had already been warned that a special unit from the police had orders to arrest him upon landing at Robert Mugabe International Airport. He had already met with Parents Shiri on a stopover in Dubai and had warned him of these plans. While the plane was taxiing on the runway, a special forces team disguised as airport baggage handlers, 100 soldiers in all, were sent to neutralize the police. And Chiwenga, once this threat had been taken care of, Chiwenga was whisked out of the airport and went to the KG6 Army headquarters a day after his return from Beijing on the 13th of November. Chiwenga held a press conference where he threatened that the military were going to intervene unless the other factions of the ZANU-PF, namely the G40, would stop actually expelling members aligned to the Koslek faction of ZANU-PF. Members of the G40 faction were under the impression that the generals were bluffing, and on the 14th of November, around 11 p.m., Major General Sibusiso Moyo went live on air, and he declared that Mugabe is safe and they are only targeting criminals around him. And this time around, the criminals around the president was Grace Mugabe's G40 faction. In 2008, it was Tsvangirai and his MDC party. And in 2008, for observers, that is when the generals actually staged their first coup. Unlike the West African variety of a coup d'etat, what was unfolding was strange. It was clear for all to see that there was a military takeover. But the generals insisted that what was taking place was not a military takeover. The army the army had not declared martial law, the suspension of the constitution, or the deposition of the country's head, at least at that point in time. While SB Moyo was telling the world that the country to stay calm, on November 15, Mugabe was now guarded not by soldiers from his usual presidential guard, but by special forces. And he was actually under house arrest. Robert Mugabe was under house arrest, and the next target for the Koslek generals, the ZDF generals, that is, was Jonathan Moyo, who for the Koslek generals was the man actually calling the shots in the G40 faction, and a platoon of 25 soldiers from the Special Air Services Unit stormed the Jonathan Moyo's house. And Jonathan Moyo had already got wind of the impending raid on his premises, and he fled to Savior Tyson Kasukuere's house, where the special teams would follow him and spray gunfire on his house. with armored cars patrolling the streets of Harare, they went on to occupy parliament, the ruling party headquarters, nicknamed the Matchbox, and the Supreme Court building. The generals denied what is taking place is a coup and decide to use the term military assistant transition. And one would ask, why were the generals so obsessed with issues relating to semantics? Part of the answer was that if their actions were branded a coup, SADC would be forced to intervene. The SADC Mutual Defense Pact empowers any country to come to the aid of member state. A member state threatened with the coup. General Chiwenga himself had knew this, and he had led multilateral intervention forces to Lesotho and Burundi. Meanwhile, while this was taking place, Jacob Zuma, the South African president, who was also the SADC chairman, sought to do the military wonders work, declaring that Robert Mugabe is, of course, is under house arrest, so that he reassured everyone that he is fine. So there was no need to hurry. Then he sent two special envoys to Zimbabwe to help with mediating the crisis. Defense Minister Nosiviwe Mapisa Ngakula, State Security Minister Advocate Wongani Bongo as mediators, and the South Africans were careful not to be seen to be telling the political elites and the generals what to do. Gwede Mantashe went actually to declare that ZANU-PF must deal with that issue because Zimbabwe is not our colony. It's not our province, it's our neighbor. If things go wrong there, of course we'll be concerned because it will impact on us, but we have no authority over them. That's the point we are making. On the other hand, President Alpha Conde, the head of the African Union, was blunt and to the point, insisting that what was taking place on the streets of Harare seems like a coup. This did not matter to the generals, with Major General Trust Mugowa still in at the African Union headquarters as part of the African Union standby. He was going to give the general side of the story. And that was a sanitized version. With the South Africans behaving like this, one would ask, why were they behaving like that? Of course, ZANU-PF is a federal liberation movement, and here what solidarity meant more than anything else. And the ANC would protect ZANU-PF at all costs. Countries in the SADC were simply going to follow what the South Africans decide. Under the guise of the fancy term mediation, they were implementing their policy of, the South Africans were implementing their policy of quiet diplomacy, which gave a free hand to the generals to go ahead with their plans. Plus, the generals were careful not to had been careful to give reassurance both to the South Africans and to the South Africans and the African Union that Robert Mugabe was safe and would be protected. Then on the 17th of November, Robert Mugabe appeared for the first time in public since the military takeover, attending a university graduation ceremony at a university in Harare. And meanwhile, behind the scenes, negotiations mediated by the Mugabe's spiritual advisor, Father Fidelis Mukonori, were taking place. But why, one would want to ask why the generals were negotiating with Robert Mugabe when they could easily impeach him. Of course, the generals wanted it to appear that Robert Mugabe had voluntarily resigned and maintained the charade that there was no coercion at all, and that Robert Mugabe was resigning from popular pressure. Now the generals realized that the mediation was not working, the negotiations were going nowhere. Then the last trick they pulled was to organize what they called a mass protest. People appeared on the streets celebrating Robert Mugabe's overthrow. Some of them were, will say, genuinely celebrating, but to the army generals, this showed that the world, this was indeed a people's revolution. However, the same generals were still protecting Robert Mugabe with soldiers stationed at the gates of his blue roof mansion. Even the leader of the opposition, Nelson Chamisa, appeared on the streets and gave a press conference where he seemed to give the stamp of approval to what the generals were doing on the streets and the removal of Robert Mugabe. Then someone on the streets actually had the audacity to hold a placard calling the generals our true liberation heroes. And then on November the 19th, Robert Mugabe was supposed to give a speech, a live televised speech, where he would announce that he would resign. Instead, Mugabe went on to insist that he would provide, he would preside over the NPS Congress that was going to be held in December. And then the generals had actually prepared a speech for Robert Mugabe with the bit where he would announce that he will resign. While he seated on the table, Robert Mugabe asked the General Chiwenga to remove their prepared speech and read one of his own in his place and skipped mentioning that he will resign. And then he cheekily said, "Asante sana," meaning thank you very much in Swahili. Later, George Charamba, one of his propaganda chiefs, explained to Chiwenga that Robert Mugabe had said he could not have resigned in front of television cameras, and that seemed to calm the general, who was furious with both Charamba and Robert Mugabe. And so on the 20th of November,
the party
Simon
wishes to announce that Comrade Mugabe has been formally notified
impeachment proceedings
of the decisions this morning.
Robert Mugabe, and
as for
gave
that,
him a deadline for
the party has instructed
Tuesday. Then
the chief whip
on the noon,
to proceed
afternoon, the
with
noon, 12
impeachment
o'clock
processes
on Tuesday, the
against
deadline
Comrade
passed, and
Mugabe,
Mugabe still had
as
not,
it has not
resigned,
received
had not actually
the
indicated
anticipated
to the,
confirmation of his resignation
to the Speaker of
from the
Parliament,
Speaker
Jacob
of Parliament.
Mdenda, that he was going to
A caucus
resign.
of ZANU-PF
The
parliamentarians,
general request the opposition
which has just concluded,
votes to pass the impeachment
was
articles.
attended by 230
Meanwhile,
ZANU-PF members
at
of
the
Parliament,
press conference, Chiwenga
out
tells
of
journalists that
260
Mnangagwa
members,
is in touch with
has
Robert
endorsed
Mugabe, that the army and
the
the president
impeachment.
were working
The
on
motion
a
of
roadmap for the
proceedings
country.
is expected
And then
tabled
fearing
before Parliament
impeachment and the
when it sits
humiliation of impeachment,
tomorrow
Robert Mugabe finally signs his resignation letter and tells the Speaker of Parliament, Jacob Mdenda, that he would actually resign, and then Jacob Mdenda reads the letter of resignation in front of members of Parliament who celebrate and the end of an era. Robert Mugabe finally resigned, and once that had taken place, Robert Mugabe's the generals and everybody else, they told him like it was now safe to come back to Harare, and then Emerson Mnangagwa made preparations to come back to Harare. He chartered Learjet took off from OR Tambo Airport in Johannesburg, and this time he had, unlike when he fled through the Mutare border post with the police pursuing him and the secret police from the Central Intelligence Organization, this time he had official protection, and he had an entourage of security personnel, and yeah, and then that was the coup, and then what was left was just when Robert Mugabe would take the oath of office, and that was on November the 24th. So yeah, this is it for the coup that was not a coup, and what was labeled by the Coast Lake generals the military assistant transition. Thank you very much. If you have enjoyed the presentation, please give me some likes, and don't forget to subscribe. Goodbye. Thank you.